Hopefully. Good. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. If you're outside in the foyer, please come on in. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 2023 ACM Web Conference, and welcome to Austin. Woo! My name is Juan, and I am one of the general chairs of the Web Conference, and it is a true honor to be here, to be able to bring the community back together, to host you in Austin, which is a place I call home. And it's extremely excited to have a packed week of content. And today we are going to close this day with a bang, a big bang, because we have the ACM Turing Award lecture of Bob Metcalfe today. I think we all know Bob has changed our lives with the creation of the technology that has transformed this thing called the internet and what the web is built on. But before I go off and start talking more, because you'll see more of me this week, I want to pass the mic to Dame Wendy Hall, who will be introducing Bob.
Oh, thank you. Do you want me to use this or these? This? Okay. Well, I might get some feedback then, but anyway. I'm going to stand here, though, because I'm old. I have to hold on to something these days. I'm Wendy Hall, Dame Commander of the British Empire. I command a little bit of the British Empire. It's probably an island off of the Falklands. But anyway, it's a huge pleasure. Well, firstly, that we're able to host the Turing Lecture at this conference and have our Turing Award winner here. And secondly, for Juan to ask me to introduce Bob. Wikipedia says of Bob Metcalfe, Metcalfe has made several predictions which failed to come to pass, including the demise of the internet during the 1990s. It was actually in 1995 he wrote a column predicting it would suffer a catastrophic collapse in 1996. At the 6th Web Conference in 1997 in Santa Clara, he famously ate his words. You pulped the column and put it in a blender, yeah? I wasn't there. There's a whole story about why I wasn't at that web conference, but I was at the conference in Toronto where he was at the keynote again when he talked about this, and that's the first time that I met him. I have a similar sort of story in that I met Tim Berners-Lee in 1990 at the Hypertext Conference in Paris, and then I saw him demo the World Wide Web at the Hypertext Conference in San Antonio in 1991. And I famously told everybody who would listen that I didn't think there was anything interesting in what he was doing and that it wasn't going to go anywhere. So I have a similar record of predicting things that don't happen. That is a little link to Bob was actually a great supporter of Tim and the web. This is the pieces I know about him. 3Com Core, which he founded in 1979 to bolster the commercial appeal of Ethernet. That company, funded Tim to move from CERN to MIT in 1994 and founded his chair there. And that, although Europe's loss was the world's gain, it really was the world's gain because from there, the strength from MIT enabled Tim to build W3C and to build the web into the phenomenon that we're here to celebrate, really, as part of the web conference. I would advertise Tuesday's History of the Web track that we're trying to get going because these are the sorts of stories we're trying to capture. So a lot of people don't know any of that. Bob also helped us launch the Web Science Research Initiative. You're in the room that the Web Science Conference was in today and tomorrow. And in 2006, we launched the Web Science Research Initiative, which was originally a joint project between MIT and Southampton. He joined the board of WSRI under the chair of the indomitable Baroness Fritchie. I don't know if you remember Baroness Fritchie, Bob, but you were on several telephone calls with her. She was trying to organise Tim and Danny and Nigel and me and Jim not to look at our laptops during meetings. Anyway, she sort of won. But anyway, we were extremely grateful for your help then. WSRI's grown up to be the Web Science Trust, a global network of labs, and sponsors the ACM Web Science Conference, and is sponsoring the reception tonight, so have a drink on us later. Now back to Bob, and why are we here today? Well, Bob is the recipient of the 2023 ACM AM Turing Award, named after Alan Turing, the Nobel Prize of Computing. On the website, this is how they describe the Turing Award. Since 1966, it has honored the computer scientists and engineers who created systems and underlying theoretical foundations that have propelled the information technology industry. It's worth $1 million, but these things it's not about the money, it's about the honor and the prestige, and we're a long time late in honoring Bob. Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn were honored early, have been previous winners for the NTOP protocols. Tim Berners-Lee has been a winner of the Turing Award for the web protocols. They were all, of course, building on the shoulders of a giant. So the thing is, with Turing Awards, like with Nobel Prizes, you have a good idea and then you have to wait 50 years to actually get the award. For those of you who are thinking about winning Turing Awards, I always thought, in my innocence, that there would be a long list of people that the ACM would honour, and somebody kept this list. And actually, it's just like the Nobel Prize. The committee is different every year, and only consider the nominations they received that year. So somebody thought that it was time we honoured Bob and put in a nomination clearly, and it's very timely. It's 50 years since his first memo, I think. So in the press release, this is why Bob won the award. Today, with an estimated 7 billion ports around the globe, Ethernet is so ubiquitous we take it for granted. It's easy to forget that our interconnected world would not be the same if not for Bob Metcalfe's invention and his enduring vision that every computer needed to be networked. He will formally be presented with the award in June at the ACM Awards banquet. It is our huge privilege, I can assure you it is, to hear his Turing lecture first here at the 2023 Web Conference. Bob, the floor is yours.
Wikipedia is wrong. I've been wrong many more times than 7. So when I heard that I was to receive the Turing Award, I was surprised, delighted, and obligated. Surprised because I'm the wrong kind of computer scientist. You know, there's two kinds, engineers and mathematicians. And I'm the wrong kind, I'm the engineer kind. And then there's two kinds of computer scientists. There are researchers and entrepreneurs. Once again, I'm in the wrong category. I'm in the entrepreneur category. So this is why I was surprised to get this fabulous award. The second, well, let me jump to the obligation part. They say if you get this award, you have to give 3 speeches, which is easy. And I got to choose. And I heard that this conference was here in my hometown in Austin. And this conference and I have a history, which you touched on. This is I believe this is the descendant of the conference at which I ate my column. It used to be called the World Wide Web. Yeah. So I, in '95, predicted that the internet would collapse. And then in '97, I came back to the same conference, and there was a bloodthirsty crowd, just like this one. And they made me eat my column, and it was a great pleasure. Anyway, I have my so-called Turing lecture right here on this table in the form of 4x6 cards. If the audience had been larger, I would have used 5x7 cards. The trouble is this speech is too long to fit in the allotted time. Give me an indication. Would you like me to just talk until it's over, or would you like to do Q&A? Raise your hand if you'd like a crack at Q&A or not. And I'm getting a no. No, I'm getting a resounding no. So that means I'm going to, what?
Q&A. Who wants Q&A? Raise your hand.
What did I say?
Who does not want Q&A? Who does not want Q&A?
So rather than talk about Ethernet, which is the subject of the award, I thought I'd pop up a level and talk about connectivity, which is my life's work. And then in going through the evidence related to connectivity, I discovered that connectivity is full of surprises. So my remarks here are all focused on the surprises that connectivity has produced and is likely to produce again. The reason for these surprises is that we consistently underestimate the impact of connectivity, so then we are surprised when it exceeds our expectations. So what is connectivity? Connectivity is that which carries stuff from A to B. There's three kinds of stuff: energy, mass, and signal. And most of us are in the signal business here. And of course, with such a big topic, there's of course a Chinese expression about it. Every talk, if you want to be persuasive, you've got to have a Chinese slide in your talk, and I'm doing it here. Anyway, if you want to be rich, build a road first. So a road is connectivity. And one of my ancestors, blind Jack Metcalfe, had a technology for roads, and he built the first 180 roads in the Industrial Revolution out of Yorkshire in England. So it's a family business, apparently, connecting. So now let me make the fundamental motivating statement. The most important new fact in the human condition, or about the human condition, is that we are now suddenly connected. And I'm going to argue that point over and over. And the key word there is suddenly, because it explains so much about what's happening. Suddenly, the internet began switching packets. That's the underlying technology. On October 29th, 1969. And since that time, in a mere 54 years, we have reached with the internet 2/3 of the human race, about 5 billion people. And in my book, that's suddenly. Now this packet switching technology that I mentioned, I got introduced to it in 1969, and then got a job at MIT, connecting MIT to the internet, although it was called the Arpanet at that time. And the fundamental purpose of the Arpanet was resource sharing. ARPA wanted to stop buying $1 million minicomputers for each one of its researchers and instead connect them up to this network that could access them all here and there. And so they gave me imp number 6. An imp is like a refrigerator. You've probably seen pictures of it. And it had ports for modems, it had ports for connected computers. And so I had number 6 and connected an MIT PDP-10 to it and began the resource sharing by working on a protocol called TELNET, which that protocol allowed you to log into any computer on the Arpanet and use it. Now watch what happens. I have the TELNET protocol. I log into a remote place to run my application, but my data isn't there. My data's here. Oh, okay. We need an FTP. We need an FTP to send our data so that we can compute on it. And then someone notices that files can be anything. What if the file was like an electronic message with a destination and a source and stuff? And then we could use FTP to move them around. And in that moment, the purpose of the internet changed. It transitioned from resource sharing to electronic mail. And for the next 20 years, in fact, you could argue email is still the killer app of the internet. But it happened just like that. Someone went, whoa, I need an FTP. Ooh, I need an email. So that was a big surprise, especially to ARPA, who had other intentions. So then I changed jobs and went to Xerox Corporation in Palo Alto in June of 1972. And the first thing they asked me to do was put Xerox onto the Arpanet, which I did. I just built the same piece of hardware again, roughly speaking. And then I got the job, I got the following amazing job. The computer science lab at the Xerox Research Center decided to build what is arguably the world's first modern PC, called the Alto. And the Alto was basically enabled by the arrival of the Intel 1103 dynamic RAM chip, which allowed this machine to have 1 million bits of memory economically. Not quite economic, in the direction of economically. And so this modern PC had a bitmap display with 500,000 bits you could turn on and off individually. It had a mouse. It had memory for programs. It had removable media, and it was going to have a network. And who did my colleagues ask to build the network? I got the job, and that was probably the biggest luck that I had in my whole life. So we began work. Grad student at Stanford named David Boggs and I, that made David rest in peace, we began working on a new network. Now, connectivity has, because it's a thing, connectivity is a thing. It's the thing. And as the thing, it needs to have math and science, and it needs to have the accoutrements of a thing. And one of those is architectures. And we had an architecture for the Arpanet and later the internet, and it was called the 7 layers of the ISO reference model. I bet there's a bunch of people in this room who can recite all 7 of them. I always have to refer to the list. Physical level, the link level, the network level, the transport level, the session level, the presentation level, and way up here, the app level. All the billionaires operate up there, and we plumbers, we operate down here. So, and the beauty of this layering is you can work on your layer without paying much attention to what's going on in all the other layers. And so we're busily working on Ethernet, and somewhere Tim, not yet, but somewhere Tim was getting ready to invent the World Wide Web. So we had this layering, and in the context of that layering, Dave and I built the first Ethernet at Xerox PARC. Let's see, since I know it's too long, I'm going to just delete those. So at Xerox PARC, we needed a network for our PCs. But there were lots of candidates. For example, a serial port to run a printer, a parallel port to run a different kind of printer. SneakerNet was the big contender. People would say, why do I need your network? I can just put my file on a diskette and carry it down the hall and put it in the printer and print my document. What do I need a network for? That was called SneakerNet. And all networks have that as a competitor. There were a bunch of Nova 800s at PARC, and there was a 16-bit parallel network that could put 15 of them on a whole network. And then there was a SIGNET, which stood for Simone's Infinitely Glorious Network. And it was worked on by Charles Simone, who subsequently became the Microsoft's 4th billionaire, because he wrote Word. But at that time, Charles was working on SIGNET. But I was a networking guy. So the forces that be got Charles to leave the networking business and go work on a text editor called Bravo, which later became Word, which later became Office, and so on. So we got Charles off SIGNET. And then there was XNet. XNet was written because Ethernet was going too slowly. and somebody in the lab figured that needed to come up with another network, 16-bit parallel network, a non-starter. It was easy to kill. And then by surprise, this new thing, this Ethernet thing, was chosen as the network that would be the dominant network for the Alto, the first PC. Now, I will admit to you that I cheated. I also got the job of writing the operating system and the connectivity facilities for a laser printer called EARS, don't ask. And EARS was 500 dots per inch, page per second, 8.5 by 11, that's 20-some megabits per second. So the connectivity couldn't be the old-fashioned connectivity that we had, or else SneakerNet would dominate. People would end up carrying their files to the printer. So I did the networking part of EARS and made it so that the only way that you could print on EARS was to FTP a file over the Ethernet to the printer. And immediately everybody at the Xerox Research Center had to have Ethernet so that they could print their documents. That's cheating. That's why Ethernet won inside of Xerox. Now, now let me contrast Ethernet then from Ethernet now. Ethernet then consisted of 3 technologies, Jerrold, Manchester, and Alohanet, which we looked for and found appropriate. The Jerrold vampire tap could tap into a piece of coaxial cable and grab hold of the center conductor without having to cut the cable. And this had the cool feature that you could install a new node on the network without bringing the network down. You just punctured the coax. And that meant we used coax as our network medium. We had hoped to use 0 wires, but we discovered that the radios were not far enough along. So we, instead of using 0 wires, we did the next best thing, used 1 wire, this coaxial cable, and we punctured it with the Jerrold tap. And then in putting packets on this coax, we had a way of putting a voltage on there or not. And we decided to Manchester encode the bits. And by the way, University of Manchester is where Alan Turing was, by a huge coincidence. But this Manchester encoding is the simplest possible encoding. There's a bit cell. The first half of the bit cell is the bit. The second half of the bit cell is the complement of the bit. And you just send those down the wire. And that guarantees that there's a transition in the middle of every bit cell, either this way or this way, and that becomes your clock. So you don't need a global synchronization clock. Every packet has its own clock, and that was a problem solved by Manchester. Manchester also is off half the time. In every bit cell, it's on and it's off, or it's off and it's on, which means during the off periods, you can look at the cable and see if somebody else is playing around, in which case you can avoid running into them. And the principal constraint that Dave and I had in building this network is a card. It could take 60 14-pin dual inline packages of the MSI variety from Texas Instruments. And so most of the constraints on Ethernet came from the 60-chip limit. So for example, we needed a clock to clock the Manchester encoder to put the bits out on the cable. We didn't have room for a clock. You know, a crystal and some passives and so on. We didn't have room for it on our card. But on the back plane of the Alto, there was a pin that had the system clock on it, which ticked every 170 nanoseconds. So we took that and we put a little wire on it, and that became our clock. That determined that the speed of the first Ethernet was 2.94 megabits per second. And that 2.94 just comes directly from that system clock, ticking every 170 nanoseconds. And then we fiddled with, the third technology then for that initial Ethernet was the Aloha network. And I spent a month in Hawaii being very careful to study it. And there were 2 things about the Aloha network that were interesting. One is it was a radio network. It was a radio WAN, a radio wide area network. So the radio wasn't quite right for our purposes. It only ran at single digit kilobits. But the other thing that was interesting was its access method, randomized retransmissions. You send, gets through, that's great. Doesn't get through, randomize and try again. The purpose of the randomization being to avoid subsequent collisions of the same two packets. That was Ethernet then. And it spread like wildfire. It was surprising. Now that I cheated with the laser printer, but all of Xerox, we soon had an internet through all of Xerox and everywhere else. And this, so there it is. Then, what is Ethernet now? There's no more Jerrold taps. There's no more Manchester encoding. And there's no more Alohanet. In fact, there are no more collisions. There's no shared cable. Ethernet now, mostly in its cable form, is a bunch of wires converging on a hub. And so it's completely different. Here are the three contributions that Ethernet really made, not the three technologies that I touched on. First, it brought packets to the desktop. Prior to Ethernet, the packets would arrive at the minicomputer, go into the TELNET protocol, and come out on the terminal wires as characters to be displayed on either paper or glass teletype. But the Ethernet took the packets and brought them all the way to the desktop so you could write programs that emitted packets and had protocols. The second thing is it brought bandwidth abundance. I said 2.9. You didn't act impressed. 2.94 megabits per second was 10,000 times faster than the cable that used to come to my desk. So in one night, it went from 300 baud to 2.94 megabits per second. That is not a 10% improvement. So after that, bandwidth became abundant. And it became practical to upload cat pictures. The third thing Ethernet brought is it joined the standards movement. It was a movement to escape vendor-specific protocols, and the TCP/IP protocols were devised to transcend vendors, and Ethernet joined. So Ethernet was standardized by the IEEE, and the other protocols mostly by the IETF. So packets to the desktop, abundant bandwidth, and standards. Those are the enduring contributions of Ethernet. There's another little one, which is in the randomized retransmission access method. There was the occasion where traffic would get out of hand and there'd be too many retransmissions and the whole channel would go unstable. And I did some math that said when you get into a high congestion situation, the smartest thing is not to try harder. The smartest thing is to back off. So Ethernet had a back off procedure. When it encountered too much traffic, it would increase the mean of the retransmission interval so that there was less, not more, less activity. And that algorithm persists. It's in today's Ethernet. It is also in TCP, and it's also in Wi-Fi. So that backup mechanism has persisted. Let's see, we're running out of time here. Oh, it's not too bad. So in the course of all this, I left Xerox in 1979 and started a company which was massively successful, which was very surprising for people who knew me. How could you have started such a successful luck? Just luck, I guess it was. So, by the way, the week I started 3Com Corporation, I got a call from a guy named Steve from a company named Apple in a city called Cupertino, and I hadn't heard of any of the three things. And this guy, Steve, had heard I was a networking guy, and he wanted to talk to me about working at Apple, and I went down to Cupertino and had lunch at a hippie restaurant there. And But I had just started 3Com. And so what I brought with me was a proposal to network Apple IIs. And I called it Orchard. Get it? Well, Steve wasn't impressed either. But he then did a very important thing, which is he didn't get angry. And for the next 20 years, he helped me grow my company with all sorts of advice. Just a slight aside, in 1995, quite a bit later than all this, Steve sent a limo to my house to take me to the debut of Toy Story at De Anza College in Cupertino. And I saw the movie, and as you know, it's a fabulous movie. And at the end, it was a big red carpet. It was a kind of a Hollywood red carpet kind of event, and I had my tux on and everything. And at the end of the film, Steve comes out. And I had been unsuccessful in getting him to put Ethernet in any Apple computer. He did this thing called Apple Talk, which was cheap, I guess, if you like that. So he's coming out of the showing, the debut of Toy Story, and I'm standing in the line, the red carpet. And he comes up, and we're chatting. It's very exciting, very glittery. And I said, Steve, I want to remind you, I mean, it's a great movie, loved your movie, but I want to remind you, Steve, that every one of those pixels was carried by Ethernet. And Steve paused for a moment, and he looked up and he said, thank you. And I've been living off that for decades now. A real booster shot. Anyway, so now 3Com is out there, going back, and we had some competition. We brought our Ethernet thing to the IEEE, and there were many conflicts there, but just to name three: Arpanet, IBM Token Ring, General Motors Token Bus, all crowding around the IEEE. We thought the IEEE's job was just to rubber stamp Ethernet, but oh no. So we spent 2 years fighting with each other. ArcNet was the first to go. ArcNet was a network produced by a company called DataPoint, headquartered in San Antonio, Texas, not far from here. And I'm reminded frequently that DataPoint was the first to bring PC networking to market, ahead of Ethernet. But I was deputized by the IEEE to ask ArcNet, DataPoint, if they wanted to submit their specifications to the IEEE for standardization. And their head of engineering, Victor Poor, RIP, he said, I'll get back to you in a month after I talked to my board. He spoke to his board, came back, called me up like he said he would, and he said, we decided not to submit ArcNet to the IEEE. We're going to just go the proprietary route. And that was the end of ArcNet. I mean, it went down the tubes. A long tube, I might admit. In fact, you could buy ArcNet today, but it no longer became a contender because the world wanted the LAN, the local area network, to be a standard. The world wanted that, customers. But we still had General Motors and IBM to deal with. The General Motors, I spoke to the guy from General Motors and I said, listen, why don't you make cars and leave the networking to us? And he wouldn't listen, so he touted this token bus thing, which died quickly. It took about a year or two to kill it. But then there was the IBM Token Ring. And IBM was 90-some% of the market in computers, and they were determined to foist Token Ring on us. And then the IEEE did a courageous thing. It made Ethernet, the token bus, and the token ring, it made all of them standards. A very courageous act, don't you think? And then they left it to us to kill each other for the next 20 years in the marketplace. And guess who won? Ethernet won, which is why I'm so obnoxious. The last battle to be fought in this arena was a thing called determinism. You remember I mentioned there's randomized retransmissions in the Ethernet. Randomized retransmissions. There were models, math models and simulation models that showed that because of that randomness, there was a small but non-zero probability that the packet would never get through. And this was frequently raised, the determinism argument, why you should use token ring instead of Ethernet. They never talked about what happens if you lose the token. I mean, the shit hits the fan when you lose the token. But none of the models looked at the token or the possibility of its loss. They just looked at the statistics of the circulation. Now, this particular attack really annoyed Dave Boggs, may he rest in peace, my close friend. And he wasn't an outspoken person, very shy, engineering guy. He let me do all the talking. But I got him on a panel in San Jose at a conference. I got him on the panel. And by that time, he'd built 100 Ethernets or more, from both at Xerox and at 3Com. And he was really annoyed by this determinism argument. So he famously said, "It appears that Ethernet does not work in theory, only in practice." Now, in this evolution, there have been some major surprises, which I call reversals. So big, I give them a separate name. But these are huge surprises. Connectivity reversals. So a guy named Herb Gross in 1953, working for IBM, made a law, Gross's law. And Gross's law basically said that the power of a computer grows as the square of its cost. The consequence of that law is that you should build bigger computers. The bigger they are, the more economic they are. And of course, he worked for IBM, so it was kind of a self-serving law. But there it was, Gross's law. And then in 1960 came a new law, Moore's law. I think Gordon, who just passed away, I might add, his law said that roughly speaking, that the transistor density of a chip doubled every 18 to 24 months, something like that. Consequence of which was little computers are better. And there was a big reversal. The whole world was going to these IBM mainframes and building computer utilities with ever larger populations of dumb terminals. And over here in Moore's Law land, Silicon Valley, everyone was building smaller and smaller computers like the Alto, which is a very small computer. And that was a big reversal. And one of its consequences is it moved Silicon Valley from Massachusetts to Palo Alto. Because that law gave Palo Alto the advantage, because they knew how to build semiconductors. So that's the Gross-Moore reversal, which meant the objects that we were connecting changed. Instead of dumb terminal connections to mainframes, we were now using things like Ethernet to connect PCs. And that was a different model and turned out to be the dominant model. The next, Ponte switch. You may remember Nicholas Ponte, a famous MIT professor, wonderful man. He's still around, by the way. I'll have to go find him. He noticed the following thing. He noticed that the entire world had decided that networking, the internet, long haul would be done with microwave towers or satellites, and short haul would be done by the AT&T copper, the 100-year-old install base of AT&T copper that was in everybody's house. And that's how the internet was going to grow. Long haul, wireless, microwave, short haul, copper. But that wasn't what was happening. The Negroponte switch noticed that long haul was going to optical fiber cables in the ground, not wireless. And the short haul was going to 6th gen or Wi-Fi. So that was a big connectivity switch, which was, I didn't name this, but Negroponte's switch it's called. It's a very famous switch. But there's connectivity surprising everyone. I think the thing that set it off is at that time, we only had geostationary satellites, which are 25,000 miles up. So there's latency to get up there and back, and we don't like latency in our networks. Now there's new kinds of satellites now. There's now LEOs, low Earth orbiting satellites that don't have this latency problem. And Elon, of course, is behind it. And so maybe this is going to switch again. I don't know. But the satellites are going up. The final big switch is Cooper's law. Marty Cooper, who in 1973 made the first cell phone call, handheld cell phone. He worked at Motorola. First person he called was his friend at AT&T. But he noticed that Marconi had invented the radio and got the Nobel Prize in 1909 for it. And Marconi's entire life was about getting the radio to go further and further. Go to the top of the hill by his villa. Go to downtown Bologna. Cross the Atlantic. His whole life was getting radios to go far. But since around 1900, that switch, Cooper's law, changed it all. And since that time, the whole trend is having radio go shorter and shorter distances, not longer and longer. For purposes of lower power and frequency reuse, you want 6G antennas to go 1,000 feet, not 1,000 miles. So that was a big switch. And so a lot of the high-tech 5G, 4G, 5G, 6G people are working. Of course, that means you need to have more antennas, which is a problem, but off they go. So those are the three big reversals. Now, I claim that the surprise was from the suddenness, that the connectivity came so quickly that we don't know how to handle it yet. We're learning how to handle it. And the exciting news is there's another wave coming right behind it. So if you thought we had too much connectivity now, wait till the next wave arrives. But there have been a succession of pathologies. So the internet's arrival has been very beneficial. For example, reducing extreme poverty dramatically over the last 20 years. But there have been these pathologies. Let me list them. The first one was hacking. So I wrote the first report of two teenagers in Los Angeles broke into the Arpanet at Christmas on 1973. So hacking has been going on for a while in the internet. The next pathology is pornography. They almost shut the internet down because of the porno that it was carrying. Fortunately, they passed a law called the Communications Decency Act, and suddenly porno isn't a problem anymore. And then there was advertising. The sophisticated, elegant intelligentsia who developed the internet never imagined that it would be used to carry ads. And then suddenly, in circa 1994, the ads started arriving. AT&T, I think they had the first paid banner ad in 94, something like that. So it took a while to discover that advertising was not a pathology. Advertising was the way the entire internet was going to be funded. So all the capital investment and all the OpEx in the operation of the internet is paid for by advertising. So advertising is not a pathology. Now, spam is a pathology that is getting too much of the wrong mail. So spam was for a while the leading pathology of the internet, but even that's been wrestled under control. We don't talk about it that much anymore. More recently, we have fake news, addiction, polarization, suicide, censorship. Some really nasty pathologies have cropped up. And my claim is that they're a consequence of being overwhelmed by the connectivity that's being delivered by the internet, and we're busily figuring it out, how to handle all of those pathologies. Wow. So there is a law. I mentioned Grosch's law, and I mentioned Moore's law. I feel obligated to mention Metcalfe's law, which was a sales tool of 3Com Corporation in 1982. We were selling 3-node networks so that our customers could try this networking stuff. 3-node networks. the customers said, does exactly what you said it would do. PFMTS, printing, file sharing, email, telecom. It does all the stuff you said, it's just not useful, which is a fairly serious condemnation of your products. So I made a chart. I went over to Stanford, and I remember making the chart, and we didn't have PowerPoint then. We had what's called 35mm slides then. By the way, I was on the board of the company that developed PowerPoint. We sold it to Microsoft in 1987 for $14 million. So I know how to use PowerPoint. But I made this slide, and then I made 6 copies of it, 35mm copies, and I put them in the carousels of my 6 salespeople. And this chart said the cost of your network went up linearly with the number sold for $1,000 each or close to it. Number of possible connections grew as the square of nodes you have. So there was a crossover point where the quadratic overcomes the linear. And so I taught my sales force to tell our customers the reason that your network is not useful is that it's too small. And the remedy for that is for you to buy more of our products. And they did. And we went public a few months later in 1984 based on that argument. Now, one of the questions I like asking about that situation is, when I made that slide, was I lying? I was head of sales and marketing, and you know what the temptation is. But I claim I was not lying because I had been at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. I had a time machine. I was able to go 10 years in the future and come back. And when I told these people their networks would be valuable, I was not lying. I was simply reporting what I had learned in the future. I rest my case. Okay, so then in 2019, 2 things happened. The internet turned 50 on October 29th, and the world was stricken with COVID-19. It is almost as if the internet was developed to be there for COVID. It's almost like that. One of the things we witnessed is that all these people, salespeople and teachers, professors, who for years have been saying they couldn't possibly teach their course on video because that interpersonal pressing of the flesh is just so vital to teaching that they could not just ever use video. COVID hit. I believe every single course at the University of Texas suddenly went video. There may be 2 exceptions. And not just at the University of Texas, everywhere. Suddenly, the salespeople didn't need to fly all over the place, and the professors didn't need to, as a general rule, have in-person lessons. So we are now trying to figure out what we're going to do about Zoom. Is everything going to be remote from here on in? You should see the real estate downtown Austin that's empty. And that's a symptom of what we're going through as we try to figure out the role of real estate in work and play and science. And it's ongoing. It's not that we don't know the answer yet. We're still looking for the right mix of hybrid. Okay. So the next generation of the internet is coming, and it's going to be infused with AI, of course. Incidentally, ChatGPT helped me write this talk. And, well, you'll hear later about the invention of Ethernet following the Magna Carta in 1066. Anyway. The question is, have we hit the limit? Do we now have all the connectivity we need? Or another version of the question is, are we getting all that we need, or is it somehow not there? And I believe we have a long way to go in connectivity. Call it headroom. There's a lot of headroom. And the strongest argument is, I call it the transistor neuron paradox. Transistors, invented in 1947, the year after I was born. I grew up with the transistor. Transistors are amazing devices compared to pitiful neurons. Now, the neurons have been in process for 5 billion years, but the transistors are 100,000th the size, 1,000,000 times faster. They're really amazing devices. But so, why are brains so much smarter than computers so far? What explains this paradox? Amazing transistor can't keep up with this pitiful neuron. What is wrong? And the answer is connectivity. The average neuron in the human body is connected, I just read, on Chat GPT, so take that into consideration. 7,000 synapses. And there were 10 to the 11th neurons, so that's, let's say, 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 15th connections, whereas Chat GPT only has 175 billion synapses, which is way lower than what the human body has. So this, I conclude from that there's plenty of headroom on connectivity per se, and that it's worthwhile studying connectivity and exploring its frontiers. Let me close by bringing you up to date on the longest range radio. There are 2 spacecraft. Tell me if you've heard this. There's 2 spacecraft called Voyager. They were announced and they were launched in 1977, 40 years ago. They're plutonium powered, and they have a radio. And the radio started transmitting 40 years ago at 22 watts at about 160 kilobits per second, I read on ChatGPT. But time has passed, and the plutonium is starting to peter out, so to speak. And but the radio is still getting through. It's down to an attowatt. That is the signal strength, an attowatt. An atto is 10 to the minus 18th. So there's not a lot of signal there, but they are recovering bits from this. And these 2 Voyager satellites have left the solar system. They are now, at least one of them is in interstellar space and heading out into the universe. So that, and that radio is sending a signal which is Manchester encoded. Okay, so we actually have a few more minutes of the allotted time. Would anyone like to ask any questions? Or
Yeah. Actually, if people want to ask questions, we can do a line here. You can do the first one. We'll probably do just a handful.
Stephen Pemberton, CWM Amsterdam. Why did you think that the internet would collapse in 1996?
Oh, why did I think the internet would collapse in 1996? There's a book about this topic. I wrote it. It's called Internet Collapses. It's despite the collapse of the internet, it's still available on Amazon.com. And there's an enumeration of the reasons. The principal one was I had tools. I was a magazine publisher at the time, but I had tools for measuring packet loss on the internet, and the packet loss had gone past 25%. And I knew that the TCP protocol did not perform well with high packet loss. So people they were using, I think it was called Netscape. They were using Netscape to peruse the web, and so you'd click on a link, and it would take forever before it would render. Forever. And a lot of that was lost packets and retransmissions and so on. So we're all watching the web slowing down because of too much traffic. So that was my basic reasoning. And one of my arguments is that prediction was a self-denying prophecy. Because all the guys responsible for keeping the network up were really pissed at me. and they worked really hard to make the internet not go down during 1996. So I was of service to the community by provoking them that way. But I got more publicity for eating my column than I have ever gotten for inventing Ethernet, which teaches you that the world likes it when people admit they're wrong. It's just an attractive, so I've been trying to do more of it. Yes.
Right. Hello. Thank you very much. I'm Alexandra Krista from Durham University. Am I speaking too loud or?
No, it's just saturating.
Yeah. Okay. I can speak with.
No, just yell at me and I'll repeat it.
All right. Alexandra Krista, Durham University, and my question. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for the travel through time and all the stories about the internet and the ups and downs and the interconnectivity message. I wanted to know, what do you think, because I was wondering if you're going to mention it, what do you think of the phenomenon of social media on the internet? Because you mentioned all sorts of positives and negatives. What's your take on the social media?
You mean Facebook?
Oh, one of them, yes.
Yep. My daughter worked there for
Twitter,
8 years.
Facebook.
So I'm restricted in what I can say about Facebook. But I think that the people at Facebook have been overwhelmed by a lot of connectivity. I mean, Mark should have made Jerrold the CEO, but he didn't, and I think that hurt him. So I think social media is a good thing. It has these pathologies, and so, for example, I even have a solution to propose. Would you like to hear it? Yeah. Everyone's wondering who's going to do the filtering or censorship or whatever it is. Who's going to do it? Government or Mark or Jerrold or Tucker? Who's going to do the filtering? And I think we should all do our own filtering. And there should be an app which takes composable branded filters. So you can take a little New York Times filter and a little of a Facebook filter and make your own filter rather than
like
rely on
RSS or something.
Like what?
Good old RSS, for getting your own, pulling the information.
Yes. Yes. But we'll see if that turns. People are trying that by degrees. I believe it's the ultimate solution rather than have other people. Rather than try to make other people filter in a way that you like as opposed to what you don't like.
I don't think they will allow us to do that. We're not getting the right ads, but anyway, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm a young scientist from Germany, and I would really like to know if you have some wisdom. What would you say would make a good scientist? Are there any special skills?
What would I say makes a good scientist?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me come at that from a slightly different direction. Science is under attack, no doubt about it. The wrong impulse is to defend science. The right impulse is to fix science. That topic is related to your question, but only indirectly. So good scientists shouldn't go around telling people that they're science. And if you criticize me, you're criticizing science. Oh, please don't do that. That's really silly. So science is like a draft of our knowledge of the world. So I guess a good scientist always leaves open the possibility that they are wrong. And if you ever find yourself believing that you can't possibly be wrong, you're not a good scientist. That's my answer to your question.
All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And we're going to have some closing statements from Professor Diana Marculescu from the WE department here at UT.
Thank you for the introduction. I have the honor to be a colleague of Bob. So I was delighted to be here to close this session. I wasn't given any instructions, so I'm just going to say a few words. Well, thank you, Bob, for an inspiring talk, for an inspiring lecture, for everyone here. I want to thank the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, which I'm a very proud member of for many, many decades, for having the vision of selecting Bob. He did say he's an unconventional winner, and, but he does impact through what he did every minute of our lives. And I'm thankful for my institution, the University of Texas at Austin, for the foresight of getting Bob here more than 10 years ago, right? 12 years ago to lead everything that has to with entrepreneurship and innovation at the Cockrell School of Engineering. Bob was the founding director of the Innovation Center at the Cockrell School of Engineering. He's an emeritus professor in our department. We didn't have the foresight to keep him on our department longer so he can be a full member of our faculty. But for all of you here, especially the young members of this community, many of you are graduate students or perhaps starting in this, I hope you have the foresight and vision to make contributions that eventually will get you to where Bob is. And I know someone here might end up there. With this, I know I'm standing between this event and reception. So thank you again, Bob. Thank you, ACM, and thanks for having me here. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I think Bob will be around for a while. People will want to ask questions and take pictures with you. And with that, thank you very much. We're going to go outside, and I think there's a reception for everybody.